It's not for everyone to be a martyr. So, second best, an ascetic. And the shepherd of hermits on the right hand of the enthroned Son of Man are the martyrs, and on the left hand, the ascetics. And in the life of the first monk, or at least the first monk that the one who touches off the great eruption of monasticism in Egypt and then throughout the Christian world, although there had been ascetics around since the start. But the organized asceticism that we call monasticism, that is a 4th century phenomenon. And it's the life of Antony by the great Saint Athanasius of Alexandria that sets that paradigm, and it's very clear in that life. The echoes of what we've been talking about. First, in the description in chapter 14 of the life of Antony, you know, he's kind of gone further and further out. He's looking for the place of his repentance, as later monks would say. Tries out an Egyptian tomb. You know, that's on the edge of the settlement. He started out at the edge of the village, and he goes out further out to the tombs and the cliffs, and then he goes further out to an abandoned fort, miles from anybody, into the deep desert. And he's there for 20 years, as I recall. And people who knew him, you know, are wondering, what happened to Antony? And by the way, the pattern of the ascetic life appears to have been clearly set in the village that he's from, because he talks with older men on the edge who are doing the same life, and he gives his sister over to a company of virgins. So there's something already well established and going on in the mid-3rd century. But anyway, so the friends, or curious anyway, go out to the fort. Is he dead? Is he alive? Some of them had heard kind of bangings and thumpings from time to time as he deals with the demons. So they break down the door. And out comes Antony for the first time in 20 years. Seen by anybody. And as Athanasius is careful to note, he comes out as an initiate from a shrine. Memistogogumenos, from the aditon. He comes out, as it were, from an aditon, from an inner, holy of holies, if you will. And memistogogumenos, initiate. I prefer to see this, and in fact the Syriac, I think, life has it. He comes out like an angel from like a priest, yes, high priest, even, I would say, from the shrine. And as Athanasius goes on, he's neither too fat, from lack of exercise, cooped up in there for 20 years, nor too skinny from not eating much at all. He's not giddy with delight at seeing the people, nor depressed, but he is altogether, the great bishop says, ento kataphysin. He's altogether natural. We are to understand that, of course, not in the sense of the later St. Augustine, but in the sense of Adam before the fall. He is, as it were, humanity restored. And then proceed a series of miracles, healings of the sick and of the blind, and so on, that are greeted by expressions of amazement that do nothing more than echo especially the synoptic Gospels and the course of Christ's miracles. And of course, and naturally, Antony is quick to say, it is not I who is acting, but Christ. So he is Christophany, in fact. To put it a little crudely as well, as has been pointed out by earlier scholars, he's a kind of billboard in the life for Saint Athanasius' defense of Nicaea. Because this is what Nicaea is meant to protect, yes? To enable the deification, the completion, the perfection, the full participation in God afforded the human being through the Word incarnate. The Antony who shows up in his letters is equally wonderful, but a little bit different than the Antony of the life. But what I wanted to underline was the Antony who is presented here as Christophany. Now that appears to have been as theophany, as temple, as presence of the divine. And that appears to have been a universal sense among the early monks of what they understood the proper goal of the ascetic life, which is simply the Christian life, intensified, as it were, to become the place of God. It comes out in the wonderful Afrahat of Persia, who doesn't know nothing about Nicaea, doesn't know nothing about any Greek writers. He's never been caught quoting an ancient Greek writer. He knows St. Paul, he knows the scriptures. He knows that. And he knows there are Christians off in the Rome direction, but he's in Persia, well, actually Iraq, northeastern Iraq, Kurdistan. He's writing in the 330s and 340s, and he gives us the perfect portrait of the transformed holy man, who is given to see the liturgy of heaven within, and is venerated and shines with the radiance of the glory and is venerated by the seraphim with the thrice holy. It's quite a remarkable portrait. As bold a portrait of the deified human being as exists in early patristic literature. Yes?
Who did you say this was?
Afrahat of Persia. Afrahat, who was never translated into Greek. The Armenians struggled to translate it, but nobody else, until the turn of the 20th century. So nobody knew about it, except people who know Syriac, yes, which was precious few in the Latin and Greek-speaking parts of the empire. Precious few. Too few. To this very day, Father Dean, I went to a patristics conference a few years ago and I saw a Greek was giving a paper on Afrahat. Oh boy! And I went, and it was a good paper. It was a good paper, and I went up to the guy and said, "This is wonderful." He was from Greece. A Greek who's doing Syriac. How many of them are there in Greece now? He said, 2. The other's my sister.
All in the family.
Yes. And it's in this same Syria. Now we have a problem arise that bears on our theme. A group of ascetics, they're called the praying ones, Metsaliane in Syriac and Evchites in Greek. And they say, why do we need all that liturgy stuff? All that apparatus of priests and bishops who only get in our hair, after all.
Protestants.
What? Well, who only we'll only get in our bishops, only get in monks' hair. You know, that's a kind of steady rule in you see in Egypt. You know, all the bishops are trying to lay their hands on the monks so they can make them priests and so incorporate them, as you will, into the ecclesiastical structures. And people like Pachomius, when Athanasius comes the first time, Pachomius hides among his monks. So the archbishop doesn't know who he is. Yes. So why do we need all that, some of them say? We can just pray, and God will show himself to us. We will be shown the Spirit and the Trinity. Why do we need that? And the answer to them comes from, of course, there was episcopal condemnation. There were several local synods and whatnot, and the Council of Ephesus ultimately condemns the Massalians. But you know, that kind of stuff never works unless there's a real answer, a real reply. Simple condemnation just never cuts it. The answer comes from the monks, and we see it again in Persia. I think the earliest instance. It comes from a writer whose name we don't know. Who's writing from somewhere, probably not far from where Afrahat was, and is addressing this problem. And his answer is based on what we started with yesterday in our first talk, on the revealed form of worship. Exodus 25. And he says in some, there are 3 churches. There is the church on high, and there is this church on earth which was revealed to us by the Spirit who gave us these forms of worship, by which the little church of the heart may be transformed and enter into the church on high. In other words, you want to partake in the heavenly liturgy, go to church. You want to be transformed from within, that you may enter the company of heaven like Afrahat sage within your heart, go to church. Because those forms are given you precisely that you may do so, that you may be transformed. And a little bit later now, that was in Syriac, so of course it didn't make any impression on all those Greek speakers east. But a little bit later, maybe shortly before the turn of the 5th century, we have a very important writer in our tradition, as important as the great Evagrius of Pontus, whom I'll come to in a moment too. And we call him Macarius usually, because his writings were preserved for us under the name of Saint Macarius of Skete, Macarius the Great of Skete, the great hermit and founder of the community of Skete. But this is not an Egyptian who's writing. He's a Syrian of some kind. We don't know his name. And he wrote, and there are 4 different Byzantine, medieval collections of his writings. They are homilies, they are answers to specific questions, they are letters, several different forms, and they've been edited and re-edited and patched together in different ways according to these. That's how the editors of these collections would have been presented. And they're wonderful. They were also preserved under for us under a false name because they were somewhat controversial. Some of the bishops suspected these of Messianism. And of course the monks knew better, but they didn't want the local episcopal inspector coming around and, you know, burning their collection, so they put them under a holy name. Evagrius was preserved in much the same way, under the name of Neil of Sinai. Monks are smarter, usually. Well, never mind. So, they keep Macarius, thank God, because this is a glorious rite. Unlike the wonderful Evagrius, who's deep and profound and pithy and abstract, Macarius is just bursts with imagery, like St. Ephraim. He's very serious in that way. Imagery drawn from the scriptures, from the natural world, from political life, from daily life, all to make his fundamental point, which we see in the first of the collection of 50 homilies, where he takes the vision of Ezekiel that we spent time on in our second session yesterday. He takes the vision of Ezekiel and says, and rehearses it, paraphrases it, and then says, now the prophet really saw what he saw. It's true, he saw the divine glory, right? But, he adds, his vision is also a signification of something yet more profound. That the soul is to be the throne of God. That the human being is to be the place of the kavod. And the four living creatures are the faculties of the intellect that are to be controlled by the charioteer, yes, Christ. In other words, he mixes Evagrius and the Phaedrus. No, Evagrius, sorry. He mixes Ezekiel and the Phaedrus. Ezekiel meets Plato, right? In a new and wonderful marriage. But it's a little bit elsewhere that I'm interested for our discussion today. And that's where he himself, like our earlier author, the author of the 12 Steps, or the Book of Steps, the Liber Gratum, talked about the three churches. So the Macarian homilist turns at one point in a collection of homilies which unfortunately has not been rendered into English, the largest and first collection, which was really a revelation. Wow. Let me recommend Greek to you, if only to read that. And it's a pretty straightforward Greek, by the way. It's not complicated like the Cappadocians when they're writing letters. God, they're awful. He says, what is the meaning of he calls it the economia and akoulouthia, the meaning, the arrangement and sequence of the divine services. He says the type of the church, or the icon of the church, in the case, I think, has been given us by the Spirit and is holy. And is there, to make a long story, I don't want to repeat it all for you, so I'll come to the crunch, that this was given us as an hypothigma, an illustration of what is at work in the soul by grace. From the sequence of from the order of the sacred ministers to the people in the nave and out, the sequence of synixis and anaphora, all of these are explained symbolically. Not that he ever takes away from the reality of what occurs on the altar. In fact, he uses the word metavolie, change, several times in a way that's about the human soul, which is meant, I think, deliberately to evoke the Eucharistic transform. The Eucharist is an illustration and an enabler, an accomplisher of the transformation of the human being. Now we have one more stage yet to go in our discussion of the monastic working out of why all that liturgy is essential. And the stage is the one that I worked on. And it cost me, as your little blurb notes, 7 years. And that was, what the hell does Dionysius the Areopagite talking about? I went to Oxford in 1970, the year of our Lord, 1973, to expose the wicked Dionysius as the fraud and fake and poison to the church that he was. Of course, I didn't arrive in Oxford with all the tools. So the first time I pulled down the Patrologia Graecae, volume 3, and opened it up, I recognized the and but. And everything else is mysterium tremendum. So after 3 or 4 years working in the bloody Greek, you know, I can finally read the bugger. And then, what the hell is he saying? What is this all about? Why this weird and elaborate language? And I was much persuaded by the prevailing scholarly consensus with which Father John Meyendorff, God bless, God rest him, bought into, as he confessed to me. He said, I was probably too much influenced by Van Est and the other Frenchies who took this line. Now this is a Neoplatonist rat in Christian sheep's clothing, wolf in Christian sheep's clothing, who's out to subvert, and the real problem is this matter of the hierarchies, because they take away from the centrality of Christ, since they make the knowledge of God a mediated thing percolating down through 9 ranks of angels and 3 ranks of clergy, you know, until it finally filters down to Joe in the pew, Joe Lunchbox in the pew, right? So it's not Christian. And I tried working with that. Once I learned enough Greek to do it, I tried working. Oh yeah, he's gonna work. I couldn't. It was like hammering a round peg into a square hole. It just wouldn't fit. The thing, and I couldn't write. Couldn't write. Just would sit down and try and write, and it just wouldn't come. I suppose because I didn't believe it. It didn't work. And then there arose another question. A real serious problem. And that was this. While all these learned Germans and French and everybody say this is a no good, this is a louse pretending to be a Christian who's out to subvert, or at the very best he's a ninny who's just muddled. I turned to St. Maximus. And Maximus thinks this is the cat's pajamas, yes? He just thinks this is, you know, it's better than sliced bread. This is great. John Damascene thinks it's great. Simeon, new theologian, doesn't talk about him, but he's there in Simeon. And Nikitas Stephatos, his disciple, just falls all over himself trying to assimilate his master, the anarchist, in some accounts, to the apostle of, of control, hierarchy. Gregory Palamas thinks he's wonderful. Gregory of Sinai thinks he's wonderful. Why do all these people think he's wonderful if he's a louse? Is that because they're dumber than all the good Germans? I couldn't quite swallow that. How did the church like him so much if he's so completely out to lunch? So I was in an impasse, and that's the year on Athos that you mentioned in my blurb. That's what saved me. Father Emilianos inviting me to spend a year at the monastery. And it was the shape of the life of the monastery, really inspired by him, the abbot, that provided me with my entree, which is maybe simply summed up as follows. The altar is the center of the Christian life. This was the life of the monastery. And everything proceeds toward and flows from the altar. That is the rhythm of the monastic life there, where the fathers spend the night, or most of them spend, some of them spend all of the night in vigil, a vigil that will conclude and realize its culmination and purpose in communion at the holy altar, in the following the orthros at the liturgy to be celebrated that morning. And then all the life in the monastery would thence flow from that communion out. So a movement in and out. And key to Dionysius's prolos, procession and return, epistrophe, a kind of breathing. I said, I'll bet that's related. And I started moving on that presupposition, and then he worked. And I discovered that liturgy, that hierarchy for him translates simply as liturgy. The ordered worship of the church, which is there to reveal the presence of the altar, Christ, within us, as it is within the church. The altar which is at the same time Sinai, the peak of revelation. Hence his mystical theology begins smack in the center of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. There's the altar. But to my point, to the point that I started with in discussing him, that is, what is this to do with the Christian and the continuity with the earlier Syrian writers? He even takes it a step further, or more explicitly in Celestial Hierarchy 3, he says the hierarchy, meaning the liturgy, stamps, entipo, stamps itself on its celebrants. That is, it impresses, it shapes us. The liturgy is not merely an icon, it is a shaping force, forming us into the priests of Christ. All of us, Christians. So let me conclude with an anecdote. And during that year I spent in the monastery, there was an old hermit who would come up from his hermitage for the great feasts. You know, out of the woods, or he's perched on some rock somewhere, a cave, probably. And he comes to the church, and there's this gorgeous service, and they have the most beautiful services at this place. Now, I think most of the Greek houses now have beautiful liturgies too, but then in the 70s they didn't. It was 6 hours of it was glorious. Choirs back and forth, bangity, 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 bang. Magnificent Byzantine chant. Splendid. So the church is splendid, dripping with gold and polished brass and silver and beeswax and wonderful candlelight and swinging chandeliers and deacons with censers and reliquaries and vestments, some of them from the Tsars. Every kind of posh. And I look at that, and I look at this little guy standing there, and he's all, you know, his rasen is all patches. One patch on top of another patch. His shoes are falling apart, his feet are practically bare. He doesn't have anything. And here's all this wealth and gorgeousness and sumptuousness going on around him, and I thought, what the hell connection does he see? Between the life he's living, between his poverty, absolute, and this wealth, between the imageless prayer he pursues, and here where images plaster every available square inch of the church walls, what's the connection? You know, those same questions those monks would have asked back in the 4th century. Why do we read all this? The elaboration of the reply is simply this. He sees what he is called to be. He sees the place of his heart, which is to be the place of the heavenly liturgy. Let's celebrate. He sees his calling. And he is present, his reality. And so back to the priest before the altar, what are we? We're sign and image of the heavenly liturgy of Christ the high priest, of the revelation of the glory of God, of ourselves, of what we're called to be. All these things at once.
Say it again.
No, I can't remember though.
I can't either, so I didn't write it down.
Yes. Huh? All right. What did I say?
The priest before the altar.
The heavenly revelation.
Sign and image of the heavenly liturgy of the great high priest, of the revelation of the glory of God.
That's number 2, number 3.
And of ourselves.
Ourselves, what we are called to be.
What we are called to be. And are. Already. In Christ. And that's why, brothers, this act, standing before the altar, is the sum and substance and center and heart of our lives. We do nothing more important. We do nothing more significant. And here we are to draw our comfort, our assurance, our hope, and our strength.
Amen.
And so I conclude.
Amen to that.
You got your 45 minutes, Eric.